church barely finished that day because as soon as the town realized that two kids, Tom Sawyer and Becky Thatcher, might be stuck in a cave, the men mobilized right away. They got their boats, they got their candles and ropes, and they went straight to the cave. The women stayed back in town to comfort Aunt Polly and Mrs. Thatcher, who were crying inconsolably for their kids. I mean, poor Aunt Polly, this is like what, the fifth crisis with Tom Sawyer in the span of a year? But nighttime came and went, but the only news they received from the caves were requests for more candles and food so that the searchers could keep going. One of the men in the search was Papa Welshman, and he came home that night to clean up, get some food, get some rest, and he found Huckleberry still lying in bed. So remember, Huckleberry was there that morning hiding from the sheriff because he didn't want to be involved in the rescue of Widow Douglas, and he went to take a nap. But it was nighttime now, and Huckleberry was still in bed. Papa Welshman went to wake Huckleberry up, but found out that he was actually down with a high fever. Papa Welshman couldn't stay to take care of him because he had to go back to search for Tom and Becky. So Widow Douglas, without knowing that it was actually Huckleberry who saved her life, she volunteered to take care of him. So the search went on all Sunday and onto Monday. A lot of the men were already coming back to rest too, while the stronger men, including Judge Thatcher, Becky's father, stayed on to keep going. The reports were that the cave was really confusing. Sometimes a rescuer would see flickers of candlelight up ahead, but when they followed it, it would actually only be another rescuer. They finished most of the known parts of the cave and were moving on to deeper parts of the cave now. But they did say that they found a wall that had Tom and Becky written on it, and nearby there was a ribbon. Mrs. Thatcher confirmed that it was Becky's ribbon, and she clung to that ribbon because it might very well be the last thing she saw of Becky. The search went on still on Monday, and still no kids. The town started to fall silent. In the first day, there was still a buzz about town because everyone was coming to help. Everybody was hopeful, energized, but there was a quietness now because people didn't want to say it, but they were actually losing hope. And not even a new scandal could rouse up everyone's spirits. So apparently, Temperance Tavern, the place where the number 2 room was, it was shut down because authorities found alcohol in the inn, which they weren't allowed to because remember, temperance is about abstinence and alcohol, and apparently they were serving alcohol there. And normally this kind of gossip would excite the town, but this time nobody cared. Nobody but Huckleberry Finn. So Huckleberry was still very sick, but there was a very short period of time when he was awake and he overheard the news about Temperance Tavern from Widow Douglas. At this point, Huckleberry had not heard from Tom and Becky's disappearance yet, so he thought that Tom must have heard about the attempted attack on Widow Douglas by Joe the Murderer that weekend, put 2 and 2 together that Joe the Murderer wasn't at the inn anymore, and Tom must have gone and looted room number 2 already. And also, maybe Tom had alerted the authorities about Temperance Tavern having alcohol so that Joe the Murderer wouldn't even attempt to go back to the inn anymore. That would have been the perfect story. That would have been the perfect plan, right? So Huckleberry, in a very weak state, he asked Widow Douglas if it was Tom who alerted everyone about it. But Widow Douglas, she just bursted out crying and she couldn't speak. Huckleberry was confused, but he still had that fever, so he fell right back asleep without knowing what happened to his friend. So let's go back to what happened on the day of the picnic. Tom and Becky, like the other kids, they stuffed their pockets with candles and they climbed up to the cave. They explored the usual caverns and passageways, and eventually they found themselves wandering the cave alone, just the 2 of them. Sometimes there were names written on the walls as they were walking, and they eventually decided to write their own names on the wall too. They wrote Tom and Becky on the wall, but they didn't realize that the wall was already bare. So they were already in a deeper part of the cave where people didn't venture towards to. Eventually, they found a mini waterfall in a cavern, and Tom walked behind the waterfall so he could show Becky what it was like for the light to shine through the water. But then Tom saw a small passageway behind the waterfall that went further down into the cave. Tom decided that he wanted to explore it because it looks like nobody has been there before, and Becky agreed she wanted to see too. She was having fun. So the two kids went, marking their path still with candle smoke. Tom and Becky saw a lot of new cool things, to be fair to them. They saw a cavern with lots of crystals in it, and eventually they came up to a cavern with a lot of bats in it. And as soon as they entered, the light from their candles startled the bats, and the bats started swooping down and flying around as bats do, and the kids had to run. They ran through corridors after corridors because it was like they were being chased by bats because the bats were trying to escape too, because of the light. And they kept running until there weren't any bats following them anymore. Now they came upon a cavern with another spring in it, and they decided it would be a good place to rest because it had water and they've been running, they were thirsty. After a while, Becky realized that it has been a minute since they've heard other kids, so she started getting anxious. She said, "Let's go back. It's probably almost time to go back home anyway." And Tom was like, "Sure, okay, but let's not go back where we came from because bats, So they started walking through other corridors that they've never been to, looking for a familiar spot to lead them back up where they came from. Becky was like, "I really don't know where we are, so I'm just gonna follow you, Tom." And Tom, on the other hand, he was still cheerful and he said they'll find their way soon. But the cheeriness became hollower and hollower as they kept looking around corners, looking at corridors to see if it looked familiar, and none of it looked familiar. The two walked for a really long time, and finally, Becky couldn't take it anymore. She was like, "Never mind the bats, never mind the rabies. Let's just go back to that bat cave so we can get out of here." And Tom was like, "You know what? You're right. Let's do it." The two turned around and they realized something horrible. They forgot to mark their path with candle smoke. So now they were really, really lost. Becky broke down right away. She was crying so hard that Tom was seriously afraid that she might die on the spot or go crazy right there. He tried comforting her by letting her bury her head in his chest. Meanwhile, Tom was really afraid himself, not to mention the echoes of Becky's cries were echoing back to them and they sounded like laughter in the distance. The only thing that helped Becky regain some sanity was when Tom started apologizing to Becky and blaming himself for getting them lost. I mean, yeah, Tom, you did do that, kind of. But with that, Becky found strength in her to comfort Tom right back and said, "Okay, I'll stop crying if you stop talking like that about yourself. Let's just focus on finding our way out. Let's just keep walking. And I'll follow you and I'm not going to complain because I actually have no idea where we are." So the two kids stood right back up and kept on walking. And they were walking purely at random now, but what could they do? All they could do was move and hope at this point. Eventually, Tom took Becky's candle and blew it out. No words were needed. It was time to save up on what candles they had left. They were walking still, and finally Becky's feet couldn't take it any longer. Imagine how long that would be, walking till you couldn't take it anymore. She sank on the floor to rest because she just couldn't anymore, and the two kids started talking about the comfortable beds waiting for them at home. They talked about their friends. They talked about how excited they were to see sunlight again. And finally, Becky couldn't help it. She fell asleep, and Tom watched her as her face relaxed from looking so stressed and tired to being so peaceful. And somehow, her looking like that actually gave strength to Tom to keep on going. But he didn't want to disturb Becky because she looked so peaceful. She actually looked kind of happy because she must have been dreaming. And Becky was dreaming. She suddenly did a little giggle like something funny happened in her dream, and she woke herself up. She looked around in a daze as reality flooded back in, and she started crying and beating herself up because how could she waste so much time sleeping? She said she was dreaming of a very beautiful place, and it seemed like heaven, and she thought that maybe it was a sign that she was headed there. Tom was like, okay, can we please not talk like that right now? Let's just keep walking. Now that you're rested, we can walk further. So the two kids walked hand in hand this time. They were silent and they were listening for water because they knew that what had started all this was that spring. So they were looking for a spring. They were looking for running water. If only they could find it, then probably they could find their way back to the mouth of the cave. So Tom and Becky kept walking and walking, and eventually they did find a cavern with a spring, but it wasn't the same spring. It wasn't what they were looking for. It was a different cavern. Becky wanted to keep going, but this time, Tom insisted that both of them should rest and drink up while they can. So both kids sat down, and Becky said she was so hungry. So Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a little piece of cake. It was apparently their quote-unquote wedding cake. I think they were playing marriage or something like that during the picnic, and Tom had kept a piece of the cake and put it in his pocket. Tom split the cake in two, and Becky gobbled hers up, while Tom ate a little bit of his and kept the rest back into his pocket. Then Becky said, okay, let's keep moving. But this time, Tom didn't want to move. He said, Becky, can I tell you something? Becky's face paled. She kind of knew what Tom was about to say. And Tom said, this is our last candle, and it's about to run out, so I think we should just stay here where there is water. Tom placed the candle on the ground so it can stand up by itself, and Becky broke down once again, and Tom just let her. Then Becky said, maybe people had started to look for them. It's been hours since the picnic, and probably people missed them already. But then both kids realized that nobody was expecting them tonight. Mrs. Thatcher and Aunt Polly thought they were going to be at the Harper's house, and the Harper kids didn't know that they were supposed to be with them. It would be a long time before people realized that they were missing. So Tom and Becky didn't have a choice but to just sit there and stare at the candlelight as it fought its way to be alive on that little mound of wax until it completely died out. And that was when both of them were plunged in complete darkness, like zero light. It's the kind of darkness where your eyes try to adjust, but it just couldn't. It just can't see anything. And you can put your hand right in front of your face, but you just can't see anything. Not your hand, not anything. Becky broke down once more. I would have. And both kids eventually fell asleep. When the kids woke up, they didn't know what day it was. They didn't know what time it was. It might be Monday. It might be Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday again. They didn't know. Tom tried talking to Becky, but she couldn't even talk anymore. All her hope was gone. And what could the kids do? The kids just sat there for hours in silence and in darkness. Tom took out the remainder of his cake and he shared it with Becky, but actually that just made them more hungry. Suddenly, there was a noise. It was kind of like a far-out shout. It must be the rescuers. Tom immediately yelled back as loud as he could, but he thought that maybe from this distance they wouldn't be able to hear them, so he grabbed Becky and they both groped their way down random corridors in the dark to get to the rescuers. The shout was becoming nearer and nearer, and the kids just groped their way to the direction of the sound. And then the kids reached a spot where there was a hole in the ground. There was no way to tell whether or not the hole was knee-high or 100 feet deep. They couldn't cross it. And the shouts went softer and softer and further away from them. Tom started yelling as loud as he could, but nobody heard them, and both kids were alone again. The kids groped their way back, and luckily they found the spring again, so the last cavern they were resting in. That in itself is quite impressive. I mean, imagine rushing out of the cavern without being able to see anything and finding your way back also without being able to see anything. I would not have found my way back. But the kids did, and both kids fell asleep. When they woke up, it was the same. Which day was it? They didn't know. Who knows? But Tom had an idea. He had some kite string in his pocket, so instead of just sitting there in the dark, he wanted to explore the cave and see if they can find a way out. He would tie the string to a rock at the spring, so he and Becky could always find their way back to water, to the spring. It was a long shot, like how long could a kite string be, but what could they do, just sit there? So Tom and Becky ventured off again, and once again, they reached another place with a hole on the ground. Tom started to feel around the wall of the hole just to see if he could reach far enough to know how deep it was, when suddenly there was a candlelight right in front of him. And with that candlelight, there was a hand, and then a face. And that face belonged to Joe the murderer. Tom yelped, and that spooked Joe the murderer, so Joe ran away immediately. It didn't seem like Joe the murderer noticed that it was Tom, because it happened so fast. It also happened so fast that Becky didn't even notice. She didn't even see the candlelight. Tom had to calm himself for a little bit. I mean, I don't blame him. And he decided not to tell Becky what he saw. Becky asked because Becky heard him yelp. But Tom didn't say anything because maybe Joe the murderer was actually there for Tom, not to rescue Tom, but find his revenge on Tom for that trial for Dr. Robinson, and he didn't want to stress Becky out even more. So Tom said nothing, and he suggested that he and Becky go back for the rest of the day. The next time the kids were awake, Tom had regained enough courage to go to explore again, but he found that Becky had already fallen into a deeper state of hopelessness. This time, Becky didn't want to venture out anymore. She was just lying there, and she said she was going to wait for death. Becky allowed Tom to still go and explore the cave if he wanted to, but the only favor she asked was that Tom would come back once in a while to keep her company, to talk to her, and when the time comes that she had to go, then Tom had to promise that he would be there for her and keep her company until the end. At this point, Tom tried to sound cheerful even though there was a huge lump in his throat. He was so tired and scared himself, but he wanted to be strong for Becky. So with that, Tom pulled on his kite string and went off into the darkness alone for the first time. Back in St. Petersburg, it was actually only a Tuesday. Mrs. Thatcher had fallen ill and Aunt Polly's hair had seemed to turn white overnight, over the weekend. But then the bells started ringing loudly in the village. Pans and pots were being banged by the people in town. And that's because the two kids who were missing in the caves, Tom and Becky, were being carried from the pier into the town. Nobody slept that night out of sheer happiness. It was the greatest night the town had ever seen. Tom laid on the sofa and told everyone what had happened. He, of course, embellished a few details as he does, but basically, Tom ventured through the cave alone, and he went back and forth so many times he couldn't even remember how many times he went out by himself. He would check on Becky, but it was clear she was slipping, and the time for her was actually near. But what could he do? He had to keep moving. He had to keep finding a way to rescue himself and Becky. So Tom kept groping his way in the dark, by the way, to check on new caverns that they might have missed. Eventually, he was just going through a passageway when something caught his eye. And this was staggering because being in total darkness, like complete darkness, nothing catches your eye. But there it was. It was as small as a needle point, but it was a needle point of blue in the distance. And that meant light. Tom scrambled over towards the pin of light, but it was too far, so he actually had to let go of his kite string. He groped his way carefully, and eventually it led to a really small hole in the cave. And when he squeezed himself out, it was the blinding light of the outside and the Mississippi River under him. If it had been nighttime, Tom wouldn't even look twice in that passageway. He would have just explored other passageways. Tom scrambled back to Becky, who actually didn't even want to move. She didn't believe him, but eventually Tom dragged her out to the passageways, and as soon as she saw that tiny pin of light in the distance, she was overwhelmed with joy. Both kids used the last of their energy to reach the crevice in the cave wall, and finally, they were out of the cave. Both kids sat there outside the small hole, and both broke down in relief. They never thought they would see anything again. They were just submerged in darkness, complete darkness for days. Eventually, there was a small boat that passed by in the river, and the kids flagged them down. They begged the men on it to help them. And the men didn't believe them at first because they were actually so far away from the mouth of the cave and from St. Petersburg as a village that the news of two kids missing haven't even reached them. But also, these kids were covered in clay, they looked tired, they looked famished, so it does look like they need a rescue. So the men took them, kept them for a day to recover, to have enough strength to go back into the town, and the men took them back to St. Petersburg. Tom was knocked out until Friday, so that was a Tuesday. Tom was knocked out until Friday, and Becky didn't really move until Sunday. As soon as Tom was well enough, he started visiting Huckleberry every day. So Huckleberry hadn't even recovered by then. So Tom had to go all the way up every day to visit him to see how he was. One day, Tom visited Becky's house because he wanted to check on her too. And Judge Thatcher had just come back from the cave as well. So apparently Judge Thatcher never stopped searching for Tom and Becky. And when Tom and Becky got back into town when they were rescued, someone had to go and fetch Judge Thatcher from the cave because he was still in there searching. Anyway, Judge Thatcher just came back again from the cave. He was out because he had to close the door of the cave and he bolted it with locks. That way, nobody could ever go in anymore. But as soon as Judge Thatcher said that, he saw something weird in Tom's face, and Judge Thatcher said, "Why? What's the matter?" And Tom said, "But Judge, Joe the murderer is still in there." As soon as Judge Thatcher heard that Joe the murderer is still in that cave that he just bolted and locked, he and the other men in town didn't waste any time at all. They took their boats again and they sailed towards the cave, and they even brought Tom Sawyer along with them. When they got there, Judge Thatcher opened the gates to the cave, and they immediately saw Joe the murderer right there, lying on the floor. Joe the murderer's face was right where the crack of the gate was, so it meant that he was looking out to the outside world during his last moments. Usually, there would be used-up candles lining the cave entrance. That was where people would leave their candles after exploring the cave, but all those were gone. So it looked like Joe the murderer was so desperate that he ate all of the candles on the ground. And they also found feet of bats, like bat feet, on the ground too, which meant that Joe the murderer probably caught them and ate them alive, ate them raw. Also, his blade was found nearby, but it was broken. It looked like he had tried to cut through a hole between a corner of the gate and the wall, but the wall was made of the mountain. It was part of the mountain. So even Joe could have known that this was a hopeless task, but he did it anyway until his blade gave up on him, because what else could he do? Just go back to the darkness? No. Joe was buried right outside of the cave, and a lot of people came in to watch the burial because it almost felt like a close to the trial for Dr. Robinson's murder. Back in town, finally, Huckleberry Finn was recovered, so Tom was able to tell him everything that had happened over the past few days. Huckleberry Finn was out sick the whole time. So now that Tom could tell Huckleberry everything that had happened, Huckleberry finally learned that it was actually not Tom who ratted out Temperance Tavern. So he said, well, that means that the treasure might already be taken away by the companion before Temperance Tavern was raided. He's probably in Texas now with the treasure. But Tom said, no. He doesn't think number 2 was room number 2 of Temperance Tavern. Tom thinks number 2 is in the cave. The boys left at once for the cave. They gathered a lot of kite string, a lot of matches, a couple of bags, and they stole a boat. It's so easy to steal a boat in this town. They sailed off, not towards the mouth of the cave, but where Tom was rescued before. They tied up their kite string when they got inside the cave, and they started moving through the cave. And Tom even stopped for a bit to show Huckleberry where he and Becky's last candle went out. Eventually, they reached the spot where Tom saw Joe the murderer that day inside the cave. And there, Tom could see with the candle that he has now that the hole he was afraid of that day was actually an incline. So it wasn't a drop, it was like a slide down. It slid down to a small space below. And Tom started feeling that cave wall again under him like he did the other day. And he asked Huckleberry because there's a spot that he could touch, but he couldn't see. So he asked Huckleberry to lean over and see what he was touching. It was a cross. That was what Joe the murderer said before. Number 2 under the cross. So the boys slid down to the space below, and Tom said, okay, let's start digging. But Huckleberry, this boy, he said, wait, let's not. This place is probably haunted by Joe the murderer now. He's a ghost now. So let's go before he comes for us. And Tom had to calm Huckleberry the F train down. Sorry, I can't swear in this podcast. But seriously, they were so close. But Tom was nicer about it. He actually convinced Huckleberry to keep going in a nice way, which I couldn't have in that situation. So the boys dug. There was a box, and in it was the treasure. The boys packed the gold coins into the bags that they brought. And when they went back into town, they stole a wagon and they started carting the wagon up the road to Widow Douglas's house. The plan was to hide the treasure in her shed because it was dark now, So they would come back in the morning and count it and split it. They were on the way to Widow Douglas's place and they passed by the Welshman's house, and Papa Welshman just came out of the house and he said, "Oh, hey, there you are. Everyone's waiting for you." And the boys didn't know what Papa Welshman was saying, but apparently everyone was waiting for them. And Papa Welshman was also headed to Widow Douglas's place, so they were anyway going to the same spot. When they got there, it was a dinner party. Widow Douglas had parties usually. She was well off, so it was not an unusual thing. But what was unusual this time was that Huckleberry Finn was invited. Huckleberry was so uncomfortable. He wasn't used to any of this, like attention, dinner parties. He wanted to sneak out, but Tom asked him to just stay calm, just eat, let's just go through with it. After dinner, Papa Welshman stood up to make a speech. He basically retold the story about how that night when Joe the Murderer tried to attack Widow Douglas, there was one more person that actually Widow Douglas needed to thank, which was Huckleberry Finn. And the Widow Douglas revealed that Papa Welshman had already told her before, that's why Huckleberry Finn was invited to this dinner, and also that she would like to take care of Huckleberry Finn from now on. And if she is able to gather enough money, she would help him open up a business someday when he's grown up. But at this point, Tom piped up and said, "But Huckleberry Finn doesn't need your money. He's rich." The adults laughed at Tom at first, but Tom went and took the bags out of the wagon, emptied the contents onto the dining table, and poured out $2,000 worth of gold coins. The adults were stunned. The boys had to explain themselves, which they did because there wasn't any point of hiding anything now. Joe the Murderer was gone. The companion seemed to also be gone. And then the adults helped the boys count the money and split the money into two. Judge Thatcher helped the boys put their money into a bank that gave them 6% interest. So 6%, whatever that interest was like 5 times what a grown adult at that time needed to live. So that means that the boys were already going to be rich forever. Honestly, the adults did a good job. I really thought that they were going to find a way to get their hands on the money. That was a lot of money. But they didn't. I thought the money was going to be stolen. Anyway, word spread, and in the next few days, all of the town's quote-unquote haunted houses and abandoned houses were ransacked in search of more treasure, but nobody found any more. And also, Judge Thatcher loves Tom now. Not only is Tom rich, Tom also saved his daughter from actual death from the caves, but also Tom rescued Becky from getting hit by that teacher. So Becky told Judge Thatcher about that story too, of Tom pretending to rip the teacher's book. Judge Thatcher said he was going to help Tom get into military school so Tom could be a soldier, or law school so that Tom could be a lawyer, or why not both? Meanwhile, Huckleberry was miserable. He lived with Widow Douglas for a while, but he was forced to bathe, he was forced to go to school, to eat at the table. It was all just so overwhelming for him. So one day, he ran away. He just didn't come back to Widow Douglas's place anymore, and people actually started searching for Huckleberry Finn like the townspeople did. But it was Tom who found Huckleberry because he knew just the spot to look, which was inside a barrel like he always used to. And when Tom found Huckleberry, he actually looked very peaceful. Huckleberry asked Tom to keep his share of the money instead. Money didn't make Huckleberry happy. Even Tom was going off to military or law school. That sounds horrible. Huckleberry said he missed all of the times when he would have adventures with Tom. He wanted to be treasure hunters, pirates, or robbers again. So Tom made a deal with Huckleberry, and Tom actually said there was no amount of money that could make Tom not a robber. It's in his blood to go and do mischief. So Tom promised Huckleberry that he would still do all of that with Huckleberry, but the condition was that Huckleberry should try to live with Widow Douglas again, just one more time, and see if he can bear it. In fact, Tom said, okay, you know what? Let's meet up tonight again, and let's start recruiting other boys too. And Huckleberry agreed. He was like, okay, that's a deal. He would try it again. And he asked Tom, so when are we meeting tonight? Tom said, at our favorite time, of course. Come meow at my house at midnight. So that's the adventures of Tom Sawyer. I won't be doing this for all books that I cover here, but I do want to recommend this book as a must read, even though you already know what's going to happen. The book is just a lot funnier. I mean, it is the Mark Twain who wrote it, so the humor, if any, that I covered here is maybe less than 3% of what Mark Twain was serving up in the book. So I genuinely enjoyed the book because Mark Twain was just so good at bringing out little thoughts and emotions that we had as kids. Some parts almost feels like a memory because of the emotion or the thought behind it. Even though I've never, and hope to never be stuck in a cave, but the rest of it was surprisingly relatable. So yeah, I enjoyed it. I recommend it as a book to read. Thank you for listening and see you in the next one.